Welcome to the launch of this year's Human Development Report. My name is Kristen Salumi, and I'll be your host from the SDG studio as we take a look at the state of our shared society, our collective quality of life, and how it has fared in the last year based on the Human Development Index and other metrics. At first glance, things look pretty good, I have to say. Overall, the world has recovered from setbacks experienced during the COVID pandemic. But if you dig a little deeper, it is an uneven recovery. Perhaps it's not surprising that the poorest countries are having the hardest time. What is surprising is how growing inequality is leading to political polarization and distrust of government institutions, and that has negative implications for all of us. We'll have more on that coming up when I talk to UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner. But first, let's hear from some world leaders. Here is UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
We are living in an age of polarization. Among communities and across regions, people are being driven apart by rising inequality, escalating conflicts, and record-breaking climate shocks. Misinformation and the breakdown of trust are tearing the social fabric and reducing space for meaningful public discourse. Divisions are deepening at a moment when cooperation is critical to our shared future. Cooperation to end conflicts, cooperation to tackle the climate crisis and advance the Sustainable Development Goals, and cooperation to agree on guardrails for digital technologies like artificial intelligence. This year's Human Development Report explores the roots of polarization and its devastating impact on sustainable development. It builds on previous analyses of people's feelings of insecurity and uncertainty, offering a path out of stalemate and division. It demonstrates that our best hope for the future is by combating divisive rhetoric and stressing the common ground that unites the vast majority of people everywhere. And it calls for the urgent expansion of our systems of international cooperation so that they can deliver on people's priorities: sustainable development, a clean environment, a livable planet, safety, security, and dignity for all. September Summit of the Future will consider exactly those questions. As we prepare for the summit, I recommend the Human Development Report as an important contribution. It shows that solutions to global problems are within our grasp by reimagining cooperation and uniting for a better world. Thank you.
The Secretary General said, "We are divided at a moment when cooperation is critical to our shared future." That is an important point that will be central to our discussion. But now it's time to hear from the President of Singapore, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who is also co-chair of the Human Development Reports Advisory Board.
The Human Development Report, since its inception 34 years ago, has been a valuable exercise in collective thought leadership on development, on how we can cooperate internationally in ways that can meet national needs as well as our collective needs. It's been an eventful 34 years with tailwinds and headwinds, but three fundamental realities will not change. First, technological and economic progress will always have winners and losers. But if we simply leave the losers be, we will all end up losing. That's the first reality. The second reality is that crises will recur, and they will grow in intensity and in the human cost they exact if we do not address them at their sources, if we do not address their underlying causes. COVID-19 will not be the last pandemic we face, or even the most serious. The floods, the droughts, the wildfires, the extreme weather events that we've seen in the last few years are not freak events. And the wars and conflicts will unfortunately continue and reappear unless we address them at their source. The third fundamental reality is that we do live in an interdependent world. It's an interdependence with its complexity and genius that will defy populist and protectionist efforts to dismantle it. Populism can dent interdependence, but it cannot alter it because it is an interdependence that brings too many benefits to all nations. We are a world in which we are linked economically, ecologically, and by a shared interest in peace that makes us part of common humanity. That reality remains. This year's Human Development Report accepts these basic realities and reimagines how we can cooperate and find common ground within our own societies and across the international community, so as to ensure that we do not have zero-sum games. Technological progress and global interdependence does not become perceived as a zero-sum game. And the report does so not just by confronting a zero-sum narrative with an alternative narrative. It does so by providing a framework for actions that can ensure that every country can contribute to global public goods that are in all our interests. And that means an increased stream of funding for the low-income and lower-middle-income countries so as to support their investments for national needs and for global public goods at the same time. It does mean giving national institutions a new lease of life, because confidence and trust in national institutions has been declining across a wide range of societies. And national institutions and the trust in them are critical for confidence in international cooperation and international institutions and the actions we can take to bolster trust in national institutions. It also means actions to give people themselves a greater sense of agency, involvement in collective actions for the greater good within our own societies as well as internationally. And it means actions which involve people in deliberative processes so that we can build common ground and build a sense of mutuality within our societies that resist the forces of polarization, debating issues and arriving at shared goals, including the shared goals of reduced inequality and emancipation of women, which are in all our interests. The actions that we can take and must take will help us prevent a multipolar world from becoming a polarized world. And they will help us build resilient and optimistic societies that are the heart of a world in which we can have shared prosperity. We cannot do so immediately. We can't reinvent multilateralism or reinvent our own societies within a year or 2 or 3 years. But we have to create momentum and we have to build optimism by taking actions now. Actions which give people that sense of agency and involvement, and actions which allow people to see that there are benefits that are spread all around, and that we're not living in a zero-sum world where someone gains only because someone loses, and one nation gains because another nation loses. We've got to build that sense of shared prosperity by taking actions now, moving with some urgency, and building optimism as we go along. And the Human Development Report charts a course for how we can achieve this.
Thank you, Mr. President, for highlighting some of the critical ways in which polarization impacts all of our lives. And now, here is the former president of Costa Rica, Laura Chinchilla, with her views on global development.
Excellencies, dear friends, as the world leaders will gather in the Summit of the Future this year, we have a unique opportunity to redirect cooperation in order to work towards the common aspirations of a better present and a promising future. The 2023-2024 Human Development Report summons us to engage in the much needed and not always easy discussion on how a 21st century architecture prone for cooperation should look like. It is rather worrisome that instead of building forward better and enhancing cooperation after the lessons learned during the pandemic, our global community is falling short. Inequalities in human development are on the rise again, and the poorest and most vulnerable countries are being left behind. In fact, we are currently more off track in our progress towards the 2030 agenda than we were 4 years ago. As the report shows, when stressing the importance of the new Gender Inequality Index, global progress in this field has stagnated after 2020. Moreover, we are witnessing the way global shocks are stirring polarization and distrust, shrinking the space for deliberation and jeopardizing international cooperation, among other destabilizing effects. It seems there is a generalized sense of uncertainty regarding our lives and perhaps, most importantly, regarding our collective future. 1 of 2 people feel they are not in control of their lives, and 2 out of 3 don't think their voice is heard at all in the political system. Clearly, something is not working properly, and orthodox approaches may be falling short. For example, closing gender gaps in education doesn't necessarily translate into closing gender gaps in economic empowerment. In 62 countries, adult women are more educated than adult men, but in those same countries, women still earn less than men. We must and can do better than this. But let's start with ourselves, expanding our focus from traditional well-being approaches and endorsing new perspectives on how to close agency gaps and easy political polarization. Our main goal should be to enable people feeling more in control of their lives, less threatened, and more empowered. I assure you, there is nothing naive in this aim. Quite the contrary, it is a rather audacious perspective, considering the rising global tensions and existential threats we are facing, such as climate change and the erosion of democratic conditions in several countries. Going forward, there is only more globally shared challenges and opportunities. Let us harness our connections to build a better future for all. I look forward to your discussions and receive my best wishes for a successful event. Thank you.
That was former President Chinchilla stressing that we should not fall into the gridlock of letting othering beget much-needed action for change. She's encouraging all of us to contribute to building a better future for all. And now that we've heard from world leaders, let's watch a presentation from the experts in the Human Development Report Office.
Tell me, how to stay alive and sane in a world that clearly just doesn't care about us having a future? This is a quote of what the doctor reports hearing from children and young people more and more. We have so much going for us. Our generation boasts unprecedented wealth and know-how. So why are we so stuck? And how do we get unstuck without resorting cheaply to violence? These questions motivate the 2023-2024 Human Development Report. In a world in which we're becoming more connected as we go deeper into the Anthropocene and the digital revolution races ahead, addressing our shared challenges in a polarized world calls for reimagining cooperation. As more than half of the global population goes to the polls this year, people are looking for answers and ways forward.
Take a step back and consider, where do we stand on human development? In our last report, we recorded the first ever drop in the Global Human Development Index for 2020 and 2021, 2 years in a row. Since then, the global HDR value has rebounded and reached a record high in 2023. The 3 components of the HDR, health, education, and income, all surpassed their pre-2019 values. But the human development path has shifted downwards. The global HDR value today is below the pre-2019 trend. This human development loss may become permanent. What is more, the global HDI figure hides disturbing divergence across countries. The HDI recovery from the 2020-2021 dip is unequal. While all OECD countries have recovered, only half of the least developed countries have done so. The poorest and weakest of our international community are being left behind. This graph shows, after decades of progress, inequality between countries at the top and bottom ends of the HDI has reversed course. The gap between very high HDI countries and low HDI countries is ticking up since 2020. Whatever its future trajectory, the HDI laws will not be able to capture all important elements restricting people's possibilities for their lives. Today, billions of people around the world report feeling worried, stressed, or sad. These feelings of distress have been increasing for some time in most countries across all human development groups, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, even when most traditional development indicators measuring human development or poverty reduction were showing progress. Clearly, we are missing some things. One of these things might be our sense of control over our lives and over our collective future in a world which is highly complex and interdependent.
We live in a tightly knit world. No country alone can tackle the challenges that spill across borders, whether they come from a virus or a warming planet. And going forward, there will only be more globally shared challenges and opportunities, not less. Because increasingly, our cross-border linkages are becoming planetary and instantaneous. Human-driven changes to our planet are deepening the connections between economies, societies, and ecosystems across the world. And digital technologies are shifting economic structures, supercharging cross-border flows of information. But instead of capitalizing on our connections, we are failing to address shared challenges. And the human toll of gridlock is huge, in lives lost or uprooted, in opportunities forgone, and in feelings of despair. As this figure here shows, the numbers of people killed and displaced because of war are now reaching unprecedented levels. But gridlock doesn't only threaten our well-being, it also spreads fear, division, and populism. An illustration of this is what we call the democracy paradox. The support for the ideal of democracy is unwavering and stable over time. 9 in 10 people think positively of having a democratic system. But for the first time ever, more than half of the global population now supports leaders that may bypass national parliaments and elections. So, how do we break through gridlock?
First, let's start with ourselves. For many, there is a sinking feeling of loss, evident in widespread stress, worry, and despair. Globally, out of 10 people, 5 feel that they are not in control of their own lives, and 7 don't think their voices are heard in the political system. We need to expand the focus of development policy from well-being, which remains important, to strengthening people's ability to determine their own future. In short, we need to close agency gaps. Across the world, feelings of insecurity, perceived human insecurity, and agency gaps go hand in hand, as you can see in this figure. People who feel insecure also report feeling less in control of their lives. The feelings of insecurity also increase polarization. Globally, 2/3 of countries show an increase in polarization. Polarization and populism are disruptive and costly and erode our ability to collectively tackle issues that transcend borders. Second, we need to dial down the temperature and push back on polarization. Polarization feeds zero-sum thinking and breeds cynicism about compromise and tolerance, resulting in gridlock. And there is hope. We actually agree more than we think. On climate change, for example, almost 70% of the population are willing to contribute their income to support climate action, but only 43% of the population think other people do. So let's correct these false realities and help bridge people across political divides.
Third, we need to build out a 21st century architecture for cooperation that invests in global public goods, that can better manage challenges that spill across borders, such as climate change, pandemics, and digital misinformation. The cost of not investing in global public goods weighs heavily on us. As you can see from this chart, many more people are expected to die by the end of the century due to higher temperatures. And regions with lower Human Development Index are expected to experience the greatest brunt, falling further behind in an explosion of inequality. We can do so much better than this. We can do better than a world always on the brink, like a socio-ecological house of cards, moving from one disaster to another. We know what the global challenges are and who will be most affected by them. We recognize that people value agency to lead lives with purpose, purpose which may be greater than their individual selves. We must do better. We owe it to ourselves, to each other, to our children and their children.
Thank you to the Human Development Report Office for that presentation. What may most resonate with our audience is the idea that we live in a world that is highly complex and interdependent, and that it will take collective actions to address these shared challenges, be they climate change, pandemics, or conflicts. And to go deeper into that topic and discuss ways to move the planet forward, I'm joined now by UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner. Thank you so much for having this conversation. To start off with, let's back up a little bit. How does one measure human development, which by all accounts seems to be going in the right direction and good overall?
Well, if you wind back 3 decades, it was first of all by going beyond income. Traditionally, and even to this day, economists measure progress, measure development by essentially measuring income, per capita GDP as it is called. What the Human Development Report and the index, the Human Development Index introduced 3 decades ago, is essentially a broader definition, rooted in an understanding it's not just income, it's education, it's life expectancy, and indeed in recent years we've introduced a broader definition of the planetary adjusted Human Development Index, taking into account also what's happening to our economies in an environmental, natural resources, quality of life sense. So where we are today, indeed, as you said, the last year has seen post-pandemic a remarkable recovery when you take the nations of the world together. So on average, the Human Development Index is recovering. 2 years of unprecedented regression have been turned around. But beneath that trend is something extremely serious, and it is what we have observed in the data that is now available, namely that there are quite a number of countries, the low income, the least developed countries, that actually are not recovering in terms of their Human Development Index. They are stuck, many of them even at levels below where they were in 2019 before the pandemic. And this obviously is extremely concerning because it points to a phenomenon we have not seen for the last 2.5 decades, one of divergence between wealthier countries and poorer countries.
And what is driving this inequality?
Well, it's a multitude of factors. First of all, coming out of the pandemic, if you were a poorer economy, if you were a poorer household for that matter, the analogy holds here, you had less resources to draw on. You didn't have savings, you might not have had health insurance. You may in fact have had a so-called informal sector job that the day you don't open your corner shop and sell something, you have no income, therefore you have no money to buy food. Countries had to borrow enormous amounts of money to stabilize their economies, to put social safety nets in place. For many of the poorest countries, they've emerged out of the pandemic heavily indebted, with very little fiscal space, as it is called, and now faced with another compounding shock, namely, in the wealthier countries, inflation was driving up the cost of capital. Interest rates were raised, and suddenly the developing world, that before could borrow maybe at 3-4%, is paying 8-9-10% to borrow money on the capital markets. It is not able to invest in recovery. it is even spending a lot of its revenue on actually servicing the interest payments it has to make. Many countries in the developing world today are paying more in interest rates than they actually invest in either their health or education sector.
Wow. And obviously, this is not good for people in countries that are losing ground, but why is it bad for the rich countries as well?
Well, what we're seeing at the moment is something that is really quite disturbing. We're seeing a world that is disrupted. The pandemic, conflicts, wars, but also economic and fiscal stress. But beneath that is also something that already began years back. Previous human development reports pointed to a grave danger to our social cohesion, first of all within countries, but also as a global family of nations. Inequality, injustice, the perception by a growing number of people that they're being left behind, they're being left out, and that turns into a sense of insecurity about the future. Then comes politics, then comes populism. You fan those fears. Fears is a very poisonous currency in politics. And what we have observed and what this year's Human Development Report really homes in on, what is happening to ourselves in our countries, because our political and governance systems are polarizing. The extremes are gaining center stage. People are turning on each other, and by extension, the narrative is also turning our neighbors as countries or other significant players in the global geopolitical economy into our enemies. This is dangerous because it essentially suggests that you should turn inward. You should defend yourself against outsiders, and the others are, in a sense, your nemesis. But this is the 21st century. We are a globally very interdependent world, whether it is on trade, whether it is on preventing the next pandemic, whether it is on addressing climate change. And what the report homes in on is that the price of populism and of radicalization and this inward-looking trend is essentially undermining our very capacity to reduce those risks to our individual countries and to us collectively as humanity.
And are there specific issues that come up consistently across the globe that people have with their elites in terms of their concerns, whether it's about climate change or migration? Are there any constants?
Well, first of all, we live in a world that tragically has more refugees and internally displaced people last year than at any point since 1945, the end of the Second World War. We have more conflicts in the world. We have protracted conflicts that are going on for many, many years. Just to think of the conflict in Syria, for example, but also in Yemen. We have new disruptions that are happening, for instance, in the context of Afghanistan. What the world is struggling with right now is, in a sense, how do we deal with these shocks? And secondly, how do we also respond to them when they become very concentrated? The issue of migration has been weaponized in many countries. And this is a good example because it is now driving political narratives, including the very populist, the very radicalizing and alienating narratives in many, many countries. The irony is that at the same time that countries are fighting migration and are fighting each other over the right response, countries are going out to try and find migrants who can come to their countries to fill jobs that are vacant. So we don't have a good way of dealing with, one, a shock-driven pressure of people moving and leaving, giving up on where they would normally see their future. And at the same time, there is no orderly and regulated migration. And this is a classic example of a failure, both within our own political systems, but also internationally on how to deal with this. Unfortunately, what it has created is a very toxic domestic political climate. And in that sense, we are not finding solutions, but rather we are finding reasons to confront each other.
And I want to come back to the conflict aspect as well and how that can affect human development. Because on the one hand, you might think that people turning inward and away from conflict might have some benefits.
Look, sometimes focusing on oneself is a very good thing. It starts with us as individuals when we invest in our education or in our health. The problem is when the narrative about one's own security or risks in terms of the future essentially blots out all that is reality in today's world. Our futures in any country today are as premised on what we do ourselves and what we do together in a country, a society, as they are on what others will do. The pandemic was such a clarifying moment, and that is why it is sometimes so astonishing that just a few years after the pandemic, there is a degree to which political populism and the narratives about, in a sense, focusing inwards, raising the borders, investing in defense and armies to defend oneself, is almost ignoring that the true risks of the greatest magnitude by virtually any expert think tank or analyst today in the world is going to emanate from not being able to deal with perhaps a zoonotic disease that was at the heart of the last pandemic. The fact that we're living in an age where digitalization and artificial intelligence, quantum computing, is creating totally new frontiers in terms of development possibilities, but also cyber crime, cyber warfare, not working together, not establishing a digital public infrastructure, a jointly regulated world in which this technology is deployed, is an existential risk to us as individuals, and some would even say to civilization. We are bound in the 21st century to work together. We are dependent on one another to mitigate the risks, but also to actually maximize the possibilities. Imagine digitalization could actually accelerate the implementation of 70% of all the targets and indicators under the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a realm of possibility that we are currently trading away out of fear of the other. And our neighbor is not our greatest enemy. The person who is, in a sense, perhaps thinking differently about their future than I do is not the greatest risk to my future. It's the paralysis of 7.5 billion people essentially drifting apart and not being able to work with one another on the great 21st century opportunities.
So what does UNDP propose to overcome these obstacles and bring people together? Do you have any solutions in mind?
There are many, and this is the reassuring part, because in the report we also study that countries can sometimes arrive at very different outcomes. Public policies matter, choices matter, informed choices matter. And the first thing that the report homes in on is this notion of agency. Too many people in our societies today feel not only insecure about the future, they feel that they actually have no control over their future. And that we have to address by, first of all, re-engaging with citizens, being able to also challenge some of the myths that are there. For instance, 70% of people when interviewed across the world would be willing to put more of their own money on combating climate change. But when you ask them, what do you think others think? They think that it's at most 40%. So here you have a classic dilemma. I would like to do more, but the others won't, so I will not move. You can take that from literally an individual right up to our global climate negotiations. We need to address misinformation, but we also need to give people a sense that they actually are able to exercise more influence over what happens, including to address the issues that threaten them, whether it's inequality, whether it is that fear that my job will be taken by others, that my children will be worse off. And therein lies, I think, a very significant part of our work, but the same then extends also to the global level. We are in the report exploring very much this notion of global public goods, planetary public goods, that essentially our own future is dependent on working with others to address climate change as a threat, or the loss of biodiversity, our ecosystems, pollution. And are we able to invest in one another in also advancing this? And we see enormous possibilities, for example, in the energy transition, to open a window that goes beyond traditional development aid, humanitarian aid in crisis, and actually a very explicit commitment to investing in these global public goods, be it the energy transition, be it a greater resilience in terms of health risks in the world, addressing inequality for that matter. And a lot of that has to do with financing. As of this year, we are the wealthiest generation in human history, if you measure it simply by the amount of money that exists in our global financial system. Close to $500 trillion is the estimate now. Are we really incapable of mobilizing just a share of that to invest in some of the greatest risks of our time, and ensuring that not only the wealthiest are at the end of an investment chain or an investment decision, but addressing the fact that in Africa today, less than 3% of the global investment in renewable energy infrastructure actually is invested on the continent of Africa. And yet it is the continent with 600 million people who still don't have access to electricity, the greatest variable in changing the trajectory on development. So we need to address also the failures in our international financial architecture, our financial system, because financing is, in a sense, the enabler that allows poor countries, wealthy countries, entrepreneurs, but also public services to respond to what we describe in the report as, in some way, the greatest risks to the future of development, but also the greatest opportunities that are out there.
And that argument has to be made in the rich countries where politicians are dealing with an electorate that is also divided in many cases, correct? The rich countries still have to convince their voters to support spending money for others when they are suffering.
Well, and that is why sometimes I think we also need to learn a very fundamental lesson. We often talk about multilateralism, international cooperation, as if it happens only in that global space. We actually have to go back to where people live and are debating their own futures. The fight for multilateralism, for the idea that we need to cooperate with one another to succeed, needs to be won around our kitchen tables, in our living rooms, in the schools and in the public halls, where people are currently feeling very pressured, very unsure, and very conflicted because narratives are being thrown at them that are extremely different. What disturbs me is that we're also living in a year where defense spending is growing exponentially. $2.2 trillion are being invested in arming ourselves. Yet no pandemic has been won by having missiles. No climate change transition will happen because we have more aircraft and more tanks on the ground. And yet the greatest threats to security are actually emanating from these phenomena. Climate change can lead to literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of people being forced to leave the place they call home. Where will they go? They will hit the borders. They will hit the kind of reactions we're already seeing right now. Thousands of people drowning between barbed wires and the Mediterranean, or indeed in the Central American context. This is not the kind of future any of us can either hope for or be very satisfied with. And that is why I always say defending our security needs to be broadened in terms of how we understand it, from a kind of narrow territorial and war-focused security to a broader human security concept, because then we can invest, yes, by all means, there will be dictators, there might be countries that exercise aggression on their neighbors, but we also need to invest in development cooperation, in development finance, because if we don't do that, we are going to create the very vulnerabilities that are going to cause the next security crisis.
Administrator Steiner, on behalf of our audience, I'd like to thank you and all of the distinguished speakers for today's global launch event for the new Human Development Report. Thank you also to the experts who contributed to this report, offering us potential solutions, as well as important information to make our shared world a better place. You can find the publication and much more on the Human Development Report Office's website and other digital platforms. Please keep the conversation going. My name is Kristen Salumi. Thank you for joining us.